let's do a little history for us here, and I will say that there have been some who have likened the abolish ICE movement, if you will, to what the Republicans have done in terms of the IRS. By hammering away at abolishing the IRS, no one was like, we're going to abolish the IRS, but it apparently made it much easier to shrink it down to the size of, the idea that there's nearly half the enforcement mechanism that there was 10 years ago is just nuts. But walk us through, when did this start? It started during the Gingrich era.
Right, yeah, that's the first time that I think we identified as kind of, even back to Reagan, there's sort of this notion that everyone could agree on that, we got to collect taxes, we got to fund the government. There's a conservative argument we made for that, and that if you want to cut taxes, you need to know that what the taxes you're cutting on paper is actually what's going to happen, as opposed to what we have now, where you just don't know in terms of how much tax people are really paying. But yeah, Gingrich comes in, and really there's these Senate hearings in 97 and 98 that they have, there's very dramatic sort of hearings with people behind like a black curtain, from the former IRS employees, talking about that. And abuses of the IRS, a lot of it focused on around collections, but then this reform bill comes up and it passes almost unanimously in the Senate. Clinton signs it. And it had a major effect in terms of how much revenue the IRS was able to collect in the following years, because basically it reorganized the entire agency. So it was a major revenue hit from that. I don't think that was quite realized at the time. But like you mentioned, if you look at the numbers in terms of how much audits the IRS was doing, how much revenue it was bringing in terms of what you would expect in enforcement revenue, it really does increase starting about 2002. It's like 3-4 years after this big reform bill is passed. It does recover. Those numbers do recover, particularly when the Democrats get into power, the midterm elections in 2006. The budget goes way up, so that the peak is 2010 when you have unified control of Congress and the presidency under Democrats. So Democrats did increase the IRS budget quite a bit, and you saw that in the numbers. There were returns on that, and that's sort of the common sense case for funding the IRS. It's like one of the very few areas of government where if you give them more money, they will give you even more money back.
Right. I mean, that is. Let's just make everybody should be very clear about this. There is absolutely zero debate in terms of the return on investment on what you put into the IRS. It necessarily gives you whatever you put in. If you fund them X, you will get X plus. Maybe it's +1, maybe it's +2, maybe it's +5, maybe it's +10. And just to go back to that Gingrich era. So if people remember, there was all these sort of like dramatic testimony, that people were afraid that they couldn't show their face because they were blowing the whistle on this. And this was also during an era where there was like a heightened amount of anti-government, which every time we have a Democrat in office, we seem to get on some level, right? This anti-federal government sentiment. And then after these reforms are passed and signed by Clinton, the inspector general comes out and says, no, none of that was true, right?
Yeah, so the GAO did reports and kind of went through and looked at the accusations, and a lot of it, was not true. It was vastly overstated. But nevertheless, the reform bill was passed too late, right?
And so during the Bush years, and particularly during the late stages of the Bush years, when the Democrats take control of the House, they re-up the IRS budget, and then obviously tax receipts increase. And since and you walked us through, it was basically since the Republicans took control of the Congress again in 2010 that things have sunk. Well, here's the question though. Is there a material difference in the destruction of and the assault on the IRS in this era, right? Starting in this period in which the Republicans controlled the budget process with the IRS versus the first one. So in other words, is there is there a more or less capacity for the IRS to bounce back as an agency?
Yeah, so I'd say much, much less. And the reason is that what happened back then is like you basically reorganized everyone. You had a whole lot more requirements and processes they had to follow, so a lot of retraining had to happen, and that slowed everything down. But everybody was still there, right? So once they learned that stuff, once they knew who to repeat to, or they knew the new rules they had to follow, they could get back to it. Whereas now those people are gone. What's been happening is there was never like a dramatic day where people were laid off en masse. People have been retiring and have not been replaced. So that's what's been happening across the government. So and they've been cutting back on training, they've been cutting back on travel. So not only are there vastly fewer people there, the training has gotten worse. And talking to a lot of IRS people, the big concern is like there's no one there to train the new people. So even if you were to turn around, tomorrow and say like we're going to give you $1 billion more, it's first of all it takes time to hire those people, and then and they're not going to be the same people that left. And as I think we'll get to in this conversation, the people who've left who are most valuable are these people who are doing the complicated audits, which is the people that auditing corporations, auditing the billionaires, trying to sort through that. It's extraordinarily complicated and complex. They're investigators, and they're gone, and you can't get back that experience overnight.
So we don't have that institutional knowledge, and I would also imagine that the multiple government shutdowns have also made it a fairly toxic place for people to work. And this is all presuming that the Democrats in the House are going to up the IRS budget. Address the first part before you address the second part of that in terms of...
Yeah, no, there was a...
Go ahead.
There was, I think, Indeed, one of these job search sites was like sharing something and showing that, government employees were searching for jobs in higher numbers, and IRS was by far the highest that I saw. I believe, and people are like, having talked to IRS employees, they think of themselves as public servants. That's more or less the ethos. A lot of people can be making a lot more money outside the IRS, the ones who are talented. And so there's already kind of an aspect of personal sacrifice for the people to be working for the IRS, but they usually believe in the mission. But now you lay them off basically you shut them down for a month. They don't know they're going to be able to pay their mortgage. Like the costs start to outweigh the benefits for some people, and they look to leave. That's definitely not going to help. In terms of the budget coming back, so this year the Democrats cut that deal with Trump to get the government back open, and it's actually constituted another cut for the IRS. So that didn't happen. So now we're talking about 2020, fiscal year 2020, which would start like this, I guess, October. But that we're talking about next year. Maybe the budget is going to bounce back up. But there was some openness from Republicans that we talked to in the Hill and background that's basically saying Trump has got his guy in the IRS now, and if he comes out and says we need a lot more money, then maybe the Republicans would come around and support a budget increase. But that hasn't happened yet, and there's some reason to be skeptical that's ever going to happen.
So walk us through. Okay, so and just lastly, all right, we reduce the enforcement mechanisms of the IRS by 40%. What in a qualitative way? What does that mean? In other words, what enforcement mechanisms are gone? Is it are they taking it out of the? Oh, they're no longer looking at low-income people as to whether they're cheating because they're low income, and if they cheat 10% and they're only paying $10,000, then why go after $1,000, right? I mean, is that? Or let me ask you that, and also ask Is it just a question of like the cheating is the same and the difficulty to find it is the same, but you might as well go after the big dollar folks because there's more money to be found there? How does that work?
Yeah. So I think the simplest way to think about it as I worked on this over time is basically if you are middle income or down for the most part, you're audited by a computer. So they just run your W-2 through there and other stuff, and it's very hard for a wage earner to hide income from the government. All the studies that have been done about this show that the people who are hiding income are people who own their own business, because a lot of that stuff is not separately reported to the government. And people who have like pass-through, like partnerships and LLCs and that kind of stuff. So that's who would benefit the most in terms of audit rate going way down, because that sort of stuff is not going to be caught by a computer. It doesn't know how much your business is making. So those are the audits that are not being done because it's, the skilled auditors, someone has to go through your stuff. You have to be flagged for audit, and then they have to start going through your stuff to find that kind of evasion. Whereas, and there's studies that have shown this, that compliance of people who get a W-2 is like 99%. And the big area where there's basically cheating happens is hiding income. So, and that's what the audits make a big impact on that.
And so
which I would point, I would just say that's sort of a built-in, I guess I say regressivity of tax administration. In other words, like it's much easier to catch, like, the bottom 85% of taxpayers than it is the top 15%, and that's what you really need the bigger resources for in terms of just headcount of people, trained personnel.
And the fact of the matter is, though, for every dollar you spend there, you're going to get back how much?
So the general overall like ROI that often is cited is 4 to 1, but I think that's like way too low, because it's basically like all the money that you put into the IRS. That includes like everything, right? But if you were narrowly to target to enforcement, I've seen them make estimates of 10 to 1 on some things.
Wow.
And then, I've talked to IRS people who are working on audits that have hundreds of millions of dollars that are at issue. It's like almost impossible to count the ROI on those cases. Someone who's making $120,000 a year and is going to come out with an audit that results in tens of millions of dollars in tax owed. So sometimes it's just off the charts in terms of what comes back.
All right. Well, it's fascinating stuff, and it doesn't seem like it's going to it's not going to be till 2020, and I would imagine every year or two that goes by with less and less institutional knowledge is that much worse, right?
Yeah, no, it's going to get worse before it gets better. But it would be a really big deal for that process to turn around and for it to start to rebuild itself. But that is something that I think definitely has to happen if you're looking at, these big, tax proposals that you mentioned are being put forward. I guess the good news, to the extent there is any good news, is that a lot of this is easy money in terms of it's an easy solution, right? It's like there's no downside to it funding the IRS. So that's something that, a Democratic administration, if there is one in 2021, could look forward to in terms of increased revenue.